I first saw Cowboy Bebop when it appeared on Cartoon Network's Adult Swim, and it is, in a word, cool. It helped popularize anime in America, and it's still the gateway anime show. It's got a noir, western-style storytelling that'll make you laugh and cry, and it comes with Hong Kong-esque action, a ton of obscure references, and a soundtrack that dictates how the story is told. And yet, its setting leaves something to be desired. I mean, it's implausible to think humans will have colonized the solar system by the 2070s, which is roughly 50 years from when this video will be published. Space exploration developing so quickly is impossible. Right? Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrich, the Alternate Historian. So Netflix is releasing their live-action remake of Cowboy Bebop, so I decided to take a look at its timeline to see what changes to history could be made to make it a little bit more plausible. And spoiler alert for one of the most influential anime of the last 20 years, I'm not diving deep into the story, but don't get upset if I drop some detail that you would prefer to learn from watching the show instead of hearing my droning voice describe it. With that said, for those who don't know, Cowboy Bebop is a 1998 anime produced by Sunrise, and while director Shinichiro Watanabe gets credit for creating it, I have to stress it was a team effort for all those involved, especially from composer Yoko Kanno, whose music was produced even before the animation began, and often the animators would draw scenes to fit whatever genre of music Kanno produced for that scene. The show follows a couple of bounty hunters, or cowboys, named Spike Spiegel, a former hitman, and Jet Black, a former cop. They are later joined by the femme fatale, Faye Valentine, the eccentric, genderless hacker, Edward, and a corgi named Ein. Together they fly around in the Bebop, a modified space fishing boat, chasing after bounty heads and getting involved in a lot of other dangerous shenanigans. Most of the episodes are standalone and can be watched in any order, with only a few following the storyline of Spike's past coming back to haunt him in the form of his lost love Julia and the heartless killer Vicious, who was once Spike's closest friend. One thing all these characters have in common is that they fail, like a lot. This is not a show where the good guys win and the hero gets the girl. Despite all being quick-witted and skillful fighters, they aren't the Mandalorian. You rarely ever see them earn a successful bounty, and thus are often starving or about to run out of fuel for the Bebop. They are all deeply flawed as well. Spike is an ex-criminal who had an affair with his best friend's girlfriend and now drifts through life not caring if he lives or dies. Faye is a con artist with trust issues who lost her memory and is also addicted to gambling. Even Jet, who is pretty empathetic and was apparently a good cop before becoming a bounty hunter, can be naive at times and was once an incredibly controlling boyfriend. They are also a bunch of idiots to a degree. A prime example is Ein, who is a valuable data dog that'd be worth a fortune if he was ever returned to his original owner, but none of the Bebop crew ever realize this and instead just put up with having a dog around that they don't want. They also complain, mope, and let their pride get in the way. In short, they're human. Their world is also flawed. To be honest, we don't know much about the history of the Cowboy Bebop timeline. This isn't a show with a ton of exposition or lore drops, which is good because it spends more time on the characters and their story, but for people like me who obsess about world building, it can be frustrating figuring out just how this future came to be. To be clear, it isn't an alternate history. Watanabe and his crew weren't trying to change the past, but one event in the Cowboy Bebop timeline does make it an obsolete piece of science fiction, and that is the Astro Gate accident of 2021, or 2022, the sources don't always agree. Anywho, this was when the Astro Gate, a structure orbiting the moon that is used to speed up travel between different points of the solar system, explodes a chunk of the moon off, leading to Earth being pummeled by rocks. About 4.7 billion people die, but what's worse, there is enough debris left in orbit that the planet won't support a large population. This encourages a mass migration of humans off Earth to settle the solar system on newly terraformed planets and moons, along with those asteroids turned into giant space habitats. Only a small population remains on Earth who use underground bunkers to avoid meteor strikes. Now, some of you may have noticed that the moon hasn't exploded. Yet. So you might be wondering, how the heck did the Astro Gate get into lunar orbit to even cause such damage? Well, unfortunately we can only speculate. Pre-accident history isn't mentioned, although we do know that Faye, who was born on Earth in 1994 to a wealthy family from Singapore, was severely injured during a shuttle accident in 2014, 7 years before the Gate accident, suggesting that private spaceflight was more advanced at this point than in our timeline. We know a little bit more, however, about what happened 50 years later in the Cowboy Bebop present of 2071. The future can best be described as grim, but not grim dark. Many places are in a state of recession, and crime is so rampant and unchecked that gangs or syndicates do their business out of their own skyscrapers. Government and the police are corrupt or ineffective and are often at the mercy of terrorists and criminals, so law enforcement has been outsourced to bounty hunters, many of whom seem only one step above criminals themselves. The common people we see are poor and suffering, with everyone just trying to survive rather than reform the system or fight back. Even our protagonists are less space heroes and more working-class Joes trying to make enough money to buy groceries. It makes the world of Cowboy Bebop that much more believable, in my humble opinion. Future culture also seems heavily influenced by China. While there is evidence of spoken and written English, suggesting it's still a common language, we also hear a lot of spoken Cantonese or Mandarin. In fact, according to the essay The True Language of the Bebop Crew by Lee at the Cowboy Bebop Addict, the language the Bebop crew speaks amongst themselves could be a dialect of Chinese. Plus, there are a lot of Chinatowns and cities across the solar system, and some have pointed out that cities on Mars look a lot like Hong Kong. This seems to suggest China had a major role in the colonization effort. This may be confirmed by the Cowboy Bebop art book, The After, but I should mention that I'm getting this second hand because copies of this thing are expensive, and I'm not 100% sure they're in English. Anywho, that book said the Chinese led the charge to evacuate Earth and account for the majority of the population of Mars. I'm guessing China missed getting the full brunt of the moon exploding, and thus was the only nation able to lead the charge off the planet. As for America, I'm guessing they weren't so lucky. Watanabe said the US was completely destroyed during the events of the Astrogate accident, so American culture might persist in some parts of the solar system, but they are not the dominant culture. That said, some places look like New York City, and baseball is still popular on Earth. We also see visual evidence of other Earth cultures. Venus, for example, looks an awful lot like Istanbul, Turkey, and there are elements of Arabic and Persian culture spread throughout the planet. I've also seen the cities of Ganymede described as being European, and Watanabe said he was inspired by Moroccan cities when designing other locales. There's also an asteroid called Tijuana, and you see Native Americans living a traditional lifestyle in some places, suggesting people from those regions survived and colonized the solar system. As for the economy and interplanetary politics, we don't know much. Interplanetary corporations like the Gate Corporation, which builds and maintains the gates used for fast travel between planets, appears to operate with little to no supervision or regulation. In fact, there is evidence to suggest the Gate Corporation is responsible for the devastation of Earth due to their rush to build the gates before they were ready. Nevertheless, the Gate Corporation continues to exist. There are also organizations like the Intersolar System Police that seem to have jurisdiction across different planets, but otherwise there is no system-wide government, and instead it looks like local planets and moons manage their own affairs, and only cooperate with each other in regards to law enforcement while allowing free trade and movement across the system, since it seems easy for everyone to travel and trade between worlds. There was at least one major war, the Titan War, fought on the same moon of Saturn. It's not clear why it was fought, but some soldiers from Mars participated in it, but whether they were one of the principal sides of the conflict or interveners, we just don't know. As mentioned, crime syndicates, like the Red Dragon, appear to be powerful entities in their own right. They operate large ships compared to governments or the police, which suggests they have a lot of resources and little opposition. They may even be heavily armed as the space battleship concepts that would have been designed in our timeline, like this one by General Atomic, which would have had several nuclear weapons. In fact, Dwayne A. Day, while writing for the Space Review, described Cowboy Bebop's style of SF storytelling as libertarian, which is an apt description of the politics of the Cowboy Bebop timeline. Even the fact that bounty hunters are known as cowboys implies a lawless society. Perhaps in the rush to terraform and colonize planets, some draconian measures had to be taken, which led to the colonies overthrowing and replacing any centralized government once things calmed down. Unfortunately, this means solar governments are completely incapable of dealing with the Gate Corporation, the crime syndicates, and terrorists. In fact, one can even read Cowboy Bebop as a critique of libertarianism, whether that was intentional or not on the part of its creators. And now for something I'm completely unqualified to talk about, the science of Cowboy Bebop. To be fair, there are aspects of Cowboy Bebop that people agree are scientifically accurate, such as the use of spinning living quarters on starships or asteroid habitats to generate artificial gravity. How spaceships move with reaction control systems is also good science. Even them being able to move in and out of the atmosphere is plausible, since ships like that have been imagined in the past, just like the Rockwell Starwrecker, which was designed to maintain giant orbital solar power stations that could beam down energy to Earth to end reliance on fossil fuels. This is also an example of why we live in the bad timeline. But now we get to the parts that are not scientifically possible! For example, Terraforming, while theoretically possible, is probably too expensive and time-consuming to be finished before the 2070s, especially with civilization on Earth being destroyed. To be fair, when it comes to Mars, it seems like the planet itself isn't totally terraformed, and instead only the cities maintain a breathable atmosphere inside their walls. But places like Venus or Ganymede seem to be completely terraformed, and that is just impossible. Then there is radiation. For example, with Ganymede, the amount of radiation you'd be exposed to would likely kill you in a couple months, without some sort of shielding, and yet most of the settlements we see on that moon are open to the sky. Maybe they figured out a solution when terraforming the moon, but then there's an even bigger issue to consider: gravity. All the planets and moons are portrayed as having Earth-like gravity, which is just not true of the solar system. A lot of people living on these planets are going to have lower bone and muscle mass compared to your baseline human, and will have hearts used to operating at a much lower gravity, which will prevent them from going to higher gravity locales, like Earth or any asteroid habitats or space stations with artificial gravity. There's also a bunch of other sci-fi nonsense sprinkled through the series. For example, apparently you can fix a spaceship by yourself with a wrench, which is hilarious since you can't do that with most modern cars. Genetic engineering also appears to be a thing for humans and animals, although it's never explained how it works. Add in AI or cryogenic freezing, and you either have to ignore it or assume that someone made a technological leap off screen. And it would have to be a huge leap, since human spaceflight at the end of the 1990s amounted to the Space Shuttle, Russia launching a few capsules, and the recently launched International Space Station. I'm guessing the creators of Cowboy Bebop are a little bit more optimistic about the early 21st century, but I think I have to go a little farther back in time if you really want to make the timeline work. How far back? Well, I think all the way back to around 1969, when Apollo 11 first touched down on the moon. Frankly, manned spaceflight hasn't made any big steps or leaps since then, although that was not for lack of trying. America's National Aeronautics and Space Administration, aka NASA, enjoyed generous funding in the 1960s and had bold post-Apollo plans, including crewed voyages to Mars by the 1980s, multiple space stations in Earth and lunar orbit with crews from a dozen to 50 people, bases on the moon, and NERVA, or the Nuclear Engine for Rocket Vehicle Application, which was a nuclear rocket engine for deep space exploration being developed for NASA since the 1950s. Reusable spacecraft like our Timeline shuttle were also part of the plan, but were supposed to be just a support craft for the space stations. Even the number of flights the shuttles were supposed to fly were ambitious, with 30 to 70 flights a year expected, and there was even talk of using the shuttle to capture or destroy hostile spaceships or satellites. And because the shuttle Columbia exists until 2071 in the Cowboy Bebop timeline, we can't set the point of divergence too far back, lest we end up erasing it from history. NASA also wanted orbital space tugs that would tow stuff between the Earth and the Moon. They would first use chemical rockets, but would later use nuclear engines. In fact, these tugs could easily have been the precursors to the space trucks we see in Cowboy Bebop. But the question remains, why did none of this besides the shuttle come to be? Well, actually, it was all one man's fault.
Nixon's back!
Okay, maybe it's a tad unfair to lay all the blame on Richard Nixon's feet. The fact of the matter is that for NASA to meet all of its post-Apollo goals, it would need a massive budget and room to grow. But this didn't jive with the political reality at the time. Public opinion for space exploration was dropping even before Apollo 11 touched down on the moon. Plus, NASA's budget was already being cut by Nixon's predecessor, Lyndon B. Johnson, who needed money to fund the Vietnam War and his domestic program, aka the Great Society. Still, Nixon was the one who personally ordered NASA's future plans to be shut down. You see, while Nixon was publicly supportive of space exploration and used the success of Apollo 11 to further his foreign policy goals, in reality, Nixon had little interest in NASA outside of what it could do to help him get reelected, since he feared unemployment in the aerospace industry could cost him California in the next presidential election. Add the fact that Nixon wanted to balance the budget without raising taxes, and you have a recipe for some serious spending cuts, and NASA's budget was sliced to the bare minimum necessary to keep human spaceflight alive. All the ambitious space missions were shelved, a couple Apollo missions were cancelled, and the shuttle became the only vehicle NASA had to bring people to space. Afterwards, NASA became just like every other non-military department in the US government, fighting over the few scraps of taxpayer money left in the budget. In fact, Nixon's space policy was so influential that it was adopted, whether intentionally or not, by every single president that came after him, regardless of political affiliation. But getting a different vision at this pivotal time would have a major impact on space exploration and possibly upgrade humanity's space capabilities enough that a colonized solar system by the 2070s would be slightly more plausible. The first thought that comes to mind is to get rid of Nixon entirely, but that is too easy. Nixon is a politician after all, and to some extent he is a slave to public opinion. So you can't just change his mind or find someone else. You need to get America to want to go further into space. So NASA would need leadership who could articulate a reason for an ambitious space program other than simply beating the Soviets. The turbulent 1960s undermined anti-communist American nationalism, and fear of the Reds just wasn't enough to motivate people anymore. NASA instead could compare space exploration to the old idea of manifest destiny, except replacing the North American frontier with that of space. But you're going to need more down-to-earth reasons as well. NASA will need a space exploration roadmap and show exactly how it could create jobs and produce technologies that could benefit the average American. In essence, NASA could become a sci-fi version of the Tennessee Valley Authority by providing jobs, educating people on science, and showing how new technology can improve their lives. And some razzle-dazzle couldn't hurt. Good marketing requires a little creativity that your average technocratic bureaucrat lacks. Thus, NASA bringing in some SF creators to sell their vision for space exploration might help sway public opinion. There is some precedence to this, as NASA did hire Arthur C. Clarke of 2001: A Space Odyssey fame as a consultant. But why go with Clarke when you can go with the guy who made a story about space wizards into a billion-dollar franchise? Yeah, it turns out George Lucas wanted to join the Air Force in 1967, but was turned down due to his speeding tickets, and when he was later drafted into the Army, he was exempted from service due to diabetes. But what if Lucas was less of a speed racer and got into the Air Force? And when his diabetes was discovered, the government didn't want to lose this nerd to the private sector, and so tasked him to make films for NASA. Could the mind behind Star Wars sell the American public on space exploration and colonization of the solar system? I don't know. Maybe, but it's a fun idea to consider. Of course, a better led and organized NASA ready to sell space to the American public still requires a leader in the White House who will champion this alternate post-Apollo future, especially when it comes to the budget negotiations with Congress. Perhaps Richard Nixon might have a change of heart in this alternate timeline, but then again, maybe not. But one person in Nixon's administration who needed little convincing was his vice president, Spiro Agnew, who in our timeline was a huge supporter of NASA and wanted a trip to Mars. Perhaps an earlier Nixon scandal forces him to resign, allowing Agnew to become president, and he pushes for more space exploration to distract the nation. Then again, this assumes Agnew's own scandals won't come back to haunt him. Or what about Robert Kennedy? Had he lived longer and been elected president in 1968, perhaps he would have pushed for a more ambitious space program following Apollo 11 to honor his brother's JFK's legacy. After all, JFK was the one who ordered NASA to land on the moon, so it makes sense for a Kennedy to set America's sights on Mars and beyond. Or what about George Smathers? As a senator from Florida, his state benefited from NASA's launch sites in Cape Canaveral. In 1968, he was also chosen by Florida Democrats to be their presidential candidate at the National Convention. Perhaps in an alternate timeline, he becomes a dark horse candidate and wins the White House, and then pushes for a more ambitious space program in order to benefit his home state. More importantly, future presidents are going to need to keep NASA's budget pretty high, just so they can pay for all their proposed missions. However, even in the best timeline, NASA isn't just going to be given a blank check, so they're going to have to at some point find a way to cut costs. I was tempted to simply butterfly away the Vietnam War or the Great Society to free up some room in the budget, but I'm concerned that making so many changes to the timeline would make it hard to predict what would happen next. As I mentioned, we can't change history too much, or else we risk eliminating our timeline shuttle, which needs to be built so Columbia can go on its last flight in 2071. But one way to decrease costs is to bring in other nations to contribute to the space program. This was proposed in our timeline as the Apollo era wrapped up, but there was disagreement in the Nixon administration on whether this would just involve foreign astronauts going on ride-alongs or having countries develop hardware for spacecraft. In my opinion, it makes sense for the America in the Cowboy Bebop timeline to go with the latter to help offset costs. European nations and Japan would probably be the first countries brought into this new partnership with NASA, with maybe even Henry Kissinger taking the lead in negotiations, which is something NASA asked him to do while he was Nixon's national security advisor in our timeline, although he never took them up on the offer. Another nation who might join this partnership is China. In our timeline, Nixon used the success of Apollo 11 to open dialogue with the leadership of the People's Republic of China, which ultimately led to his famous 1972 visit to China and the thawing of relations between the two countries. Perhaps in the Cowboy Bebop timeline, space exploration also improves relations between America and China, with China building hardware for America and sending their astronauts to NASA, at least until they gain their own launch capacity, which will need to happen a lot sooner than 2003, when they put the first human in space in our timeline, if they want to be able to lead the colonization of the solar system after the Astrogate accident. Perhaps all of this interest and investment in spaceflight heralds an earlier rise of private spaceflight companies that can also share some of the cost. It will probably begin as the plaything of billionaires and celebrities as it is in our timeline, but over time NASA and its partners might begin farming out more routine missions to private companies, like flying supplies to space stations in order to focus on more ambitious goals, like trips to the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Either way, private spaceflight needs to be far enough along to make Faye's disastrous trip with her family happen in 2014. And of course, this more ambitious era of space exploration means technology is developed at a faster pace and whole new fields are opened up, like cryogenic freezing, and these filter to the general population. Eventually, some lucky genius discovers a hitherto unknown quirk of physics that lets the Astrogate be built, which explodes in 2021, causing the defining incident of the Cowboy Bebop timeline. But of course, none of that happened. And while I am happy the moon didn't crack in two, I'm still left disappointed with our present. In this video, I wanted to show what changes we needed to make to history to get the Cowboy Bebop timeline. But in some ways, we did get the future of Cowboy Bebop. The people of that future aren't trying to expand the frontier. They are just living day by day and fleeing from their past. I mean, on its face, who wouldn't want to be a space bounty hunter with amazing hair? But in reality, even in a timeline where humans have colonized the solar system and space travel is commonplace, you still need to pay bills, and if you aren't careful, you will just become another forgotten grave. The moon may not have exploded in our timeline, but the pace of life in our present wouldn't be alien to the Bebop crew. But here's the thing. Whether it's the present of our timeline or the Cowboy Bebop one, it could be better. In both timelines, the resources are there to push into infinity, but both societies have set up self-imposed obstacles. It's too expensive, or it's too hard, or, my favorite excuse, what about spending that money on the needy at home? I hate to break it to you, but when that excuse is used, rarely does that money go to those who need it. The fact is, we don't have to keep following a decision made a half a century ago. We can go back to the moon, and to Mars, and even beyond, and we can help people on Earth at the same time by sharing the benefits from the technological and scientific discoveries made along the way. It's a big project, but it can be done. Adults were alive to not only read about the Wright brothers' first flight, but to watch a man walk on the moon. Leaps like that can be done again, but it will take both government investment and private enterprise working together. It will take the brightest minds and bravest adventurers from across the world putting their all in getting us beyond the grass of Earth. And yes, sorry to drop the worst curse word, but it will also take taxes. But I still think it will be for the benefit of all. And maybe, just maybe, we will get our space cowboy future. Not the bleak one we saw in Cowboy Bebop, but one where we're all striving to build a better world in the stars, not because we have to, but because we chose to. Whew, and now that I finished with my optimistic and naive rant, maybe we can do all that while watching the live-action remake of Cowboy Bebop. I know live-action anime adaptations have less of a success rate than live-action video game adaptations, but based on what I've seen, I'm cautiously optimistic. Even if it's just fine, it's still cool to see more Cowboy Bebop, and I've heard they're planning to add to the canon, so maybe we'll even get some new stories, which is cool. Well, that's what to say on the subject. If you enjoy what I do, please like, comment, subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrovich, the Alternate Historian. See you, Space Cowboy.